Have you ever wondered how you got the right to vote? It feels like a fundamental right, something that's always been there. But the story of the vote in America is a dramatic, centuries-long struggle, full of surprising twists and turns. It's a story not just about who can vote, but more importantly, about who was deliberately kept from the ballot box. Let's unravel the hidden history of American voting rights. Our story begins not in 1776, but even earlier in the American colonies. In those days, voting wasn't for everyone. Far from it. The right to vote was a privilege reserved for a tiny, elite group, white, male, Protestant landowners over the age of 21. Think about that for a second. If you didn't own a significant amount of property, you were considered to have no stake in society. The founders, men like John Adams, feared that allowing the poor to vote would lead to chaos, that they would vote to take away the property of the rich. So, from the very beginning, the vote was tied to wealth and status. Women, African Americans, Native Americans, and even many poor white men were completely excluded. The idea of universal suffrage was seen as radical and dangerous. Then came the American Revolution. The famous cry was no taxation without representation. This powerful idea started to chip away at the old justifications. After the war, states began to reconsider their rules. One of the first major changes was the gradual elimination of the religious requirement. Slowly, Catholics and Jews gained the right to vote in states that had previously barred them. The next big hurdle was property. Over the next few decades, a wave of democratic fervor swept the nation. Newer states joining the Union, especially on the frontier, often had more liberal voting laws to attract settlers. They started to drop the property requirements, replacing them with a simple tax-paying requirement, or eventually no economic requirement at all. By the 1830s, the era of Jacksonian democracy, most states had granted the vote to nearly all white men. This was a huge expansion, celebrated as a victory for the common man, but it's crucial to see who was still left out. As the door opened for poor white men, it often slammed shut even harder for others. For example, some states like New York and North Carolina, which had allowed free black men who owned property to vote, actually took that right away during this period. The expansion of democracy for some came at the direct expense of others. The mid-19th century brings us to one of the most seismic shifts in American history, the Civil War and Reconstruction. The war to end slavery fundamentally transformed the question of citizenship and voting. With the Union victory, 3 crucial amendments were added to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people, and guaranteed them equal protection of the laws. And then came the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870. Its text is powerful and direct. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. For the first time, the Constitution explicitly protected the right to vote for black men. What followed was a brief, remarkable period during Reconstruction. With federal troops protecting their rights, African American men voted in massive numbers across the South. They elected thousands of black officials, from local sheriffs to U.S. senators. It was a moment of unprecedented political participation and a glimpse of what a multiracial democracy could look like. But this progress was met with a violent and determined backlash. White supremacist groups used terror and intimidation to stop black people from voting. And as Northern commitment to Reconstruction waned, federal troops were withdrawn in 1877, leaving African Americans to fend for themselves. What came next was the era of Jim Crow. Southern states couldn't legally deny the vote based on race because of the 15th Amendment. So, they created a web of discriminatory tactics designed to achieve the same result. They implemented poll taxes, forcing people to pay a fee to vote, which disproportionately affected poor black and white sharecroppers. They instituted literacy tests, which were often administered in a completely biased way. A black voter might be asked to interpret a complex legal document, while a white voter was asked to simply write their name. Grandfather clauses were another cynical invention. They stated that you could only vote if your grandfather had been eligible to vote before the Civil War. This, of course, conveniently disenfranchised almost all African Americans whose grandfathers had been enslaved. Through these sinister methods, black political power in the South was systematically dismantled. By the early 1900s, voter registration among African Americans had plummeted to near zero in many areas. It was a brutal and effective suppression of the democratic process. While this was happening, another massive struggle for suffrage was gaining momentum. The women's suffrage movement. For decades, women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been fighting for the right to vote. They organized, marched, protested, and were often arrested for their activism. They argued that the principles of democracy and equality should apply to women, too. The movement was long and difficult, facing fierce opposition. Many argued that women's place was in the home, not in the messy world of politics. The fight intensified in the early 20th century, with a new generation of activists employing more radical tactics, like picketing the White House. Finally, after World War I, in which women had played a crucial role on the home front, the tide turned. It was a monumental victory, doubling the size of the American electorate overnight. But again, the victory was not complete. For many women of color, especially in the Jim Crow South, the 19th Amendment meant little in practice. They still faced the same racist barriers of poll taxes and literacy tests that blocked black men. The next great leap forward came during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Activists organized voter registration drives, marches, and protests, often facing brutal violence, to demand the federal government finally make good on the promise of the 15th Amendment. The televised images of peaceful protesters being attacked in places like Selma, Alabama, shocked the nation and mobilized public opinion. President Lyndon B. Johnson, seizing the moment, pushed Congress to act. The result was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This landmark piece of legislation was one of the most effective civil rights laws in American history. It outlawed literacy tests and other discriminatory tactics. It also included a crucial provision, Section 5, which required states and counties with a history of discrimination to get federal approval or preclearance before changing any of their voting laws. The impact was immediate and profound. Within a few years, black voter registration and turnout in the South surged dramatically. So, where does that leave us today? You might think the story ends there, with the vote finally secured for all, but the debate over voting rights is far from over. In 2013, the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County v. Holder struck down the preclearance formula of the Voting Rights Act. The court argued that it was based on outdated data from the 1960s. Almost immediately after that decision, several states passed new voting laws, such as stricter voter ID requirements, cuts to early voting, and purges of voter rolls. Supporters of these laws argue they are necessary to prevent voter fraud. Opponents argue that they disproportionately harm minority, elderly, and low-income voters who are less likely to have the required ID or the flexibility to vote on a single Tuesday. The fight over who gets to vote and how easy it is to do so continues to be one of the most contentious issues in American politics. From property-owning white men to the universal ideal we strive for today, the history of the vote is the history of America itself. It's a story of expansion and contraction, of hard-won victories and frustrating setbacks. It shows us that the right to vote isn't something to be taken for granted. It was fought for, bled for, and won by generations of Americans who believed in a more inclusive and representative democracy. Understanding this history is essential to protecting that right for the future. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments what part of this history surprised you the most. See you next time.